I first want to thank Claudia and her team for all of their help in making this event possible and for their partnership for tonight's event. It's really been a pleasure to work with Hammer. We look forward to more collaborations with you in the Hammer and on further north on campus. As Claudia said, I'm David Myers, and what's of greatest relevance tonight is that I direct the UCLA Initiative to Study Hate and the UCLA Bidari Kindness Institute, which are devoted to studying those poles of the emotional spectrum, hate and kindness. And we are pleased to be joining forces with other co-sponsors, including the UCLA Department of English, the UCLA Department of Comparative Literature, the Division of Social Sciences, whose Dean Adele Valenzuela is with us tonight. Thank you so much for being here, Dean Valenzuela. The Division of Humanities and its Dean, Alex Stern. We're all joining forces in order to mark the occasion of Adam Phillips' residence, as it were, over the last 2 days here in Los Angeles. Today is the third talk in a series of 3, which as a whole have really been an intellectual feast to date. Today's discussion is also part of the Bidari Kindness Institute's Compassionate Conversations series, in which we engage themes and thinkers to reflect and model the values of kindness and empathy. We began this series in the fall with Dr. Yasmin Abou-Frecha, and we are actually continuing next week on Tuesday with a lecture by Dr. Jamil Zaki, author of the book The War for Kindness. And then in April we will be hosting the Parents Circle, which is a group of Palestinian and Israeli families who have lost loved ones. If you would like more information on any of these events, you can go to our website, kindness.ucla.edu. So as he has about most matters of importance to the human condition, Adam Phillips has written a book on kindness, or rather co-written it with Barbara Taylor. It's this book, which I believe is available for purchase after tonight's conversation. And the book is at once an intellectual history, really a history of the concept of kindness, and a reflection on the place of kindness in the sprawling edifice of modern and especially Freudian psychoanalysis. This book reflects Adam Phillips's qualities at their core: erudition, concision, indeed a real economy of language, sweeping synthetic ability, and of course a keenly critical judgment. And when we wanted to foster a conversation about kindness in ways that would be both compassionate and passionate, we knew we could do no better than Adam Phillips. And it's really just such a great pleasure, and thank you, David Russell, for all you did to make this possible. Really, we appreciate it. A final word. I want to thank all who made this 3-part series possible, and especially our own Bidari Kindness team, Maria Patlan, Felicia Graham, Maya Ferdman, and our chief logistical supervisor, Dr. Maya Mora, who labored so hard and yet took sick over the last couple of days and thus is not able to be with us. But we do want to thank Amalia for all of her incredible hard work. And now I'd like to hand things over to our colleague, the distinguished author and professor of English at UCLA, Mona Simpson, to commence our compassionate conversation. Mona.
Thank you, David. Thank you, everyone who's worked so hard to make this happen. It's very exciting to have Adam here. So Mona and I were talking about how to start things off, and we decided to take a leaf from Adam's books. Well, actually, Adam's technique. As psychoanalysts are always, you have to pay attention to their technique. For years, Adam used to come, still does. When I was working in my previous job at Oxford, we'd bring him to run a seminar on ordinary language psychoanalysis. That's what we called it. Psychoanalysis is in ordinary speech. And Adam, I noticed, had this technique of taking his subject for the session, and he'd normally talk about a very specific work by them, but he'd begin by providing a really interesting, I guess, sort of commonplace book or cento or collection of phrases by the person under discussion from around their work. And it was a kind of brilliant technique because it was sort of set the tone. So in the last week I've been looking through Adam's works, and I've been looking for connections to kindness, themes of hatred, kindness, and psychoanalysis. And I thought we'd just begin by reading a bit of Adam to Adam, to which he can then respond. So, I'll begin. This is Adam. People are leading secretly kind lives all the time, but without a language in which to express this, or cultural support for it. Kindness, not sexuality, not violence, not money, has become our forbidden pleasure. Today, it is only between parents and children that kindness is expected, sanctioned, and indeed obligatory. Love, freed from hatred, kills fellow feeling. What would I have to say about one of my dislikes to make you think I was phobic of it, rather than just very discriminating? It is very difficult to surprise oneself in one's own mind. We are at our most stupid in our self-hatred. Because we are always shadowed by the possibility of not getting what we want, we learn at best to ironize our wishes and at worst to hate our needs. Psychoanalysis is about what you see when you're not looking. Good writing, like good conversation or interpretation and analysis, seems to free something in us. It is as though mobility has sprung from paralysis, but only once we start moving do we realize quite how stuck in we had been. Is it the aim of psychoanalysis to make people kinder or to make them more unpredictable? The patient in psychoanalysis is cured when his past is no longer of particular interest to him. And again, on psychoanalysis, no other kind of doctor includes as part of the treatment an analysis of the patient's confidence in the doctor or of the patient's relationship to being helped. Psychoanalysis is about curiosity more than knowledge or even cure. And psychoanalysis, at its best, reveals one's repressed repertoire of untaken and alluring risks. And finally, this is a quotation from one of Adam's earlier essays. For me, for all sorts of reasons, there has only been one category, literature, of which psychoanalysis became a part. Why have an analysis when you can read? Why have an analysis when you can read?
Are you asking me that question?
Yeah.
A great question.
Well, the obvious answer to the question is that analysis is a conversation, and reading is a different kind of conversation, because your interlocutor is silent. I think in a way it's a misleading provocation, that, because I think even though there are clearly overlaps, I think when somebody goes for psychoanalysis, they go because they are really suffering from something. Now, of course, we may read because we're suffering from something, but it seems to me we don't read in order to be cured. We don't necessarily read in order to feel better. We may do, but we may not. And I think they're very different practices. I think my sense of the overlap was simply, I read Freud initially as a writer, not as a doctor or a psychoanalyst indeed. And it seemed quite clear that there was a real overlap between Freud and his modernist contemporaries, that there was a cultural conversation going on in which Freud had some very interesting things to say, but so did Virginia Woolf, who said to me. There were loads of competing voices here, but they had overlapping preoccupations. And obviously one of the preoccupations was the nature of relationship, between the sexes, but also relationships one's relationship with oneself. And that seemed to be, I mean, we could go on for hours talking about this, but it clearly, for me, that psychoanalysis is of a piece with literature. The dispiriting thing is that so much psychoanalysis is so badly written. And I think it's a kind of, it's a lot of work for people to make something so interesting sound so boring. And it's almost like this is an exaggeration, but it's like a death wish. It's as though we mustn't get overexcited. You know, we're not writing great novels here, we're writing psychoanalytic theory. And there's terrible dulling goes on, because the actual practice of doing it is fabulous. It's really interesting and moving and so on, in the way that literature is. But the writing in psychoanalysis has let it down, I think.
Adjust your microphone.
How's that? Is that better? Say something, Adam.
That's better for you, but not for me.
Well, actually, I wanted to ask you about writing. I was very interested to hear how you started writing. I read your interview in the Paris Review, done by Paul Oldgraber, who's here tonight. And you said, I had never had any desire to be a writer. I wanted to be a reader, which makes perfect sense. So I thought what you do is you do all the research, which I did, and then you take a month off and you write the book. So I took a month off work, and for literally 3.5 weeks, I did nothing. I sat around drinking coffee, reading the paper. I just couldn't do it. It was really terrible. And it was exactly like the way writers talk about writing, which is a feeling that I really wanted to do something and had a lot to say, and I was a blank. It was as though there was nothing inside me, so I could no more write a sentence than I could stand on my head. It was absolutely impossible. No amount of willpower, no amount of resolution, determination, conversation with my friends made it happen. But it was as though at a certain point, something literally got me to the typewriter and I started typing. It just never stopped. It had a grip on me, and it gave me amazing pleasure to do it. Since then, it's always been a version of that. And you said today in your talk at noon that you write, that you do analysis Monday, Tuesday, Thursday, Friday, and Wednesdays are your writing day.
Yeah.
And you say that it just always happens.
Yeah.
So my question is, do you think it will continue? Is it, and do you think it's because you're only doing it once a week that it's flowing so beautifully?
Well, I think so. In other words, I don't find myself wanting more time to write. I've always been haunted by a bit of Miles Davis's autobiography, where he describes a moment when he said he would always wake up in the morning with music in his head. And one morning he woke up and there was no music. At which point he became, a drug addict, an alcoholic, had sex with 100 women, etc. And he really fell apart. And even then, I never had any desire or ambition to be a writer. But it always struck me that it would be a terrible thing if whatever it was wasn't there. And you couldn't will it. There'd be nothing you could do. So that certainly was in my mind before I thought about writing. Just let me give you a bit of background to that story.
Please.
Because I came, as I said the night before last, I think it was, I had no a conscious intention or ambition to be a writer. I wanted to be a reader. Like everybody else, I wrote essays at school and university, but it wasn't part of my pleasure. It was fine, but that was it. And it didn't occur to me to do this. Then I went to a supervision with Christopher Bolus, and he told me that the Nouvelle Revue, which is a French psychoanalytic magazine, wanted small sections written. I went home and I wrote one in about 10 minutes, and it was thrilling to me. Then Christopher Bolus told me that Frank Commode, who was sort of my hero at school, who was a great literary critic, he edited a series in Britain then called Fontana Modern Masters, which were very, very interesting books. And that he was looking for a Fontana Modern Master on Winnicott. And Kit said to me, write to him. So I sent him the piece on tickling. And he wrote back, return of post, Dear Mr. Phillips, no one wants to tickle old men. Your paper reminded me how much I miss it. Could we have dinner? which we then did. And we got on really very well, and he gave me the commission to write the book. I then, because I obviously had no idea how to write a book, I never met a writer, so what I thought was, as is mentioned there, you do all the work. So I read all of Winnicott twice, I went to Columbia Medical School and read the papers. I did everything I thought I was supposed to do. I took a month off work, and then I literally couldn't do anything. I mean, I was clueless. It wasn't about trying, I just couldn't do anything. And I realized then this could be a terrible mistake, that I'd got myself into something without really thinking it through. And then, as I said in that interview, at a certain point, I can literally remember just getting off the couch I was lying on. I was reading the Guardian newspaper, and I went to the other room and went to the typewriter, as it then was, and I started writing. And it was completely fluent. And it was thrilling. Because it had, you know, obviously it had come from somewhere, and I had the experience of immersing myself in this writing, which I really love. And then I could do something with it. But it wasn't an act of will, if you see what I mean, or an act of conscious decision. It was something that happened to me, in a way. That's what it felt like.
You've also said, which is an interesting idea, that really you couldn't change your writing if you tried.
Yeah.
And I think that's true of all of us. But it's also an interesting question, do you revise at all? Do you change your writing?
Hardly at all. I mean, to begin with,
explains your prolixness.
well, to begin with, I was just beglamoured by the idea of myself as somebody who just wrote these things. It seemed sort of wonderful to me. So I didn't revise. I did read over what I'd written, but it was very much to do with the sound of it. You know, the Frost thing. Look after the sound and the sense will take care of itself. Well, I thought that was right. And so if it sounded right to me, I would leave it. I wouldn't leave in things that were pernicious or silly, but I would leave in anything that I had a question mark about, that I liked the sound of. And it felt like a sort of collaborative project, as in, you write it and then people tell you what they think of it. So that seemed fine to me. But the more I did it, the more I enjoyed doing it. And it then had a rhythm to it, and it was as though, obviously I don't know this, but it was as though unconsciously I was preparing to start work on Monday morning, on Wednesday morning. So I would do my normal work Monday and Tuesday, and then I would walk to work. And very, very often, the first sentence of the essay would come to me. And I hadn't been researching this or thought about it. Just there it was. So I would then sit down and start writing, and there it was, as if it was pre-written. It wasn't automatic writing, but it was a bit like that. As I've gone on writing, I've done a bit more revising, but I don't like revising because I feel like it interferes with what I've written.
Interesting. I read somewhere that you've only written in that one room, and you believe you couldn't write anywhere else.
Well, I hope that isn't true.
I do too.
Because
we're trying to lure you to LA.
Well, it's rather confining, but it's just happened, pragmatically, that I've always written in one room. I've always really admired the romance of people who write in cafes or in hotel bedrooms and all that sort of stuff. But I've never been able to do it. In fact, it's never occurred to me to do it. So when I go to hotels, or I don't go to cafes except to have coffee, when I go to hotels, I never take my computer with me. It doesn't occur to me. So I'm a bit bound by this, but I'd like to be unbound by it. But I love the room I write in. It has a view over a roof that is kind of wavy, which is an architect's office. And then further down there are trees and there are birds and so on, and it's sort of rather beautiful. So there it is.
And you said just now that you go for a walk and the first line of your essay comes. And you've written about essays. You've edited essays. You've edited Charles Lamb, Walter Pater, Burke. And you've also written about the fact that psychoanalysts don't tend to call what they write essays. They call them papers or proceedings or diagnoses, but not essays. And why does the essay matter to you as a psychoanalyst?
Well, I think this begins before the psychoanalytic thing, because I always really loved and liked those 19th century essayists, if you see what I mean. And so reading Emerson and Hazlitt and Lamb and so on, I think they were fabulous. So it was that way round. it then seemed really rather, in a rather dreary way, pretentious that analysts refused to write essays. And that was partly because they wanted to affiliate themselves with the scientific genre of writing, which is actually extremely boring, but it does have a form. And I had no wish to write like that. It just didn't sort of interest me. But I did think, you read Emerson or you read Hazlitt, etc., and you think, this is amazing. And it gives you a huge amount of freedom because you're not trying to prove something, and you can meander and wander and digress and all these things. And an essay is trying something out. So it's in a sense, it's an experiment in writing. And I think that appealed to me. I presume that one writes the sentences one writes because of the sentences one has read. Well, I read a lot of that literature when I was at the university and afterwards. And so it then came naturally, or seemed natural to me, to write in an essayistic form. Wasn't consciously intended, but that was how it actually came out.
And then what seems to drop out of the picture, which is interesting, reading your essays about psychoanalysis, is there's not a lot of diagnosis in them. You don't go around saying, this is obsessive compulsive and this is narcissistic. And in fact, your language is a much more ordinary language, kindness being a word that we don't find a lot in Freud, say.
Yeah.
We find hate, but we don't find so much kindness. But we do find, narcissism and hysteria. So is there an access, I was thinking, is there an access that this sort of essay tradition gives you to areas of human experience that you might not otherwise have?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think that because psychoanalysis is actually about the most ordinary thing in the world, it shouldn't be difficult to be interested in it. And so what I didn't like about psychoanalytic writing was the private language of it, the professional jargon of it. And it seemed to me unnecessary. You didn't have to write like that, or you didn't have to affiliate yourself with a group by speaking their language. And it seemed to be very misleading in some way to learn psychoanalysis by learning the language of a specific psychoanalyst. Because my feeling about it was, I didn't put it like this, but my feeling about it was that psychoanalysis is something you should grow through and grow out of. And not grow out of as in repudiate, but make something of your own of it.
Yeah.
Of course, you can join the psychoanalytic army, as most people do, and that's fine if that's what you want to do. But if you can make something of your own of it, then it seems to me to be more alive and more fun.
So that's the connection to the ordinary. Like we all have ordinary
exactly,
lives.
it is, yeah.
But also, I was wondering what you think about this, because I've been rereading you for weeks now, and one theme through your work that's pretty interesting is there's an invitation to the reader to say what you think of as ordinary and therefore unremarkable is in fact very remarkable. So that, and a lot of your book titles have this sort of sense of sort of Unforbidden Pleasures is one of your titles of your book, right? You think, well, if it's an unforbidden pleasure, it's that's like getting coffee in a coffee shop. Like that's an unforbidden pleasure, but is it worth writing about? And there's a way in which you're kind of stopping the reader and you're saying, pay attention to this because there might be more to it.
Yeah.
Which is really kind of a philosophical approach.
Sorry?
It's kind of a philosophical approach, almost more than the usual psychoanalytic.
Yes, I think that may be right. I mean, I think if I could design it, which I can't, I would want people to read the books because they enjoy them and then forget about them. But in the process of reading them, they may be intermittently struck by something. And that's the point. I don't want them to come out reading one of my books able to say, Phillips thinks X, Y, and Z about this. I would rather people would read my essay and have their own thoughts, that it would be evocative and provocative, so that you come out with your own experience of reading, not with your experience of reading me. Because I can't see the point of that, really. So what I would want is that it would be pleasurable and sufficiently interesting. Now, after all, there are so many wonderful books. There's got to be a good reason to read the book you're reading.
That's true. Another way your writing is different from most of the psychoanalytic writing I've come across from Freud on is that you don't seem to be given, especially in your more recent work, you don't seem to truck much with case histories. And I don't know if that's because of discretion, but I think it's even more than that because your tendency in general is you write clearly, but you favor abstractions. You like ideas. You're not given to elaborate examples.
Yeah.
And in that way, I think you do diverge from Freud and those.
It's actually a deliberate policy on my part.
I wondered that.
Not to write about patients.
Is that a moral concern?
Well, yes, I mean, I think that people shouldn't talk about clinical work in public at all. I think that even peer discussion is really awful. So it should just be something that goes on between two people, and then you might have a supervision to talk about a case. But I don't think people should write about their patients or talk about them. It should be known beforehand. This is completely private. Once you accept that, because of course the analyst will then say, but how's anybody going to learn? Well, you learn by doing it, in fact. And I think that the genre of case history is very, very limited. I think, don't bother with that, read short stories or read novels, if you see what I mean. Because the genre is one in which I, the writer who's an analyst, is trying to prove something. And of course, what's being proven is not something singular, but something generalizable. And this is the problem, in a way, with psychoanalysis, which is it's really committed to the singularity of individual history, and it only speaks in generalities. So this is a puzzle, if you see what I mean, because either the case history is representative, we can all, as well, relate to it, or it's effectively so idiosyncratic it has a different function. And so I think people should do psychoanalysis and not write about it chemically.
How do you know when that's occurred?
Well, you only know because you're not preoccupied by a sense of repetition. And
It's obsession.
The sense of things being stuck. I mean, if you're depressed or anxious or whatever, you are thinking about yourself a lot. So the aim for me of analysis is to enable people to lose interest in themselves, to be able to be absorbed in other people and things. And it seems to me, although I think this may not be generally true, that one is actually the least interesting person one knows. That other people are far more interesting than oneself. This is not a modest comment, you understand, but they're more interesting because they're other people. And I think that's one of the things, if you like, that's one of the ambivalences in psychoanalysis. Because Freud is clearly, on the one hand, it's a self-knowledge project. But on the other hand, and certainly subsequent to Freud, there's been real doubt about the value of self-knowledge, both the existence of it and the significance of it. And clearly, you can use so-called self-knowledge to preempt experiences. So one of the best things psychoanalysis has done has made people wonder about what, if any, self-knowledge is useful and what it's useful for. So it's not about as though you get more and more and more and more knowledge about yourself as though you're a character in a novel. It may be what's enabled in you by the analysis is the facilitation of new experiences.
So do you see then that the patient takes more interest in the therapist in the course of the healing?
No. That may be part of it, but I think more interest, it gets displaced, more interest in the world outside the therapy. So the therapy begins often, if it actually works, to be very, very preoccupying and kind of centralized. But gradually, if it works, it's decentered. It's a way back to the world, not an attempt to make the best world possible between the analyst and the patient.
Thank you.
It's not a refuge.
Right.
That's the point.
Another question. Don't be shy. David has a question. Please. Get to you next.
Thank you so much for this talk. My question relates to the American psychologist G. Stanley Hall, and if any of his works or ideas were influential in your analysis and your work over the years.
I only know about Hall historically. I don't actually know about his work, because I think I'm right that he was one of the first people who, as it were, welcomed psychoanalysis into America. And I think when Freud and Jung came, they were invited by him. But I don't know, and this is a very typical bit of sort of parochialism, that I know he's a significant figure and I know nothing about him. And that's how impoverished one's psychoanalytic education is historically.
Mm. There's a question right there. Okay.
Hi. Thank you so much for everything that you've shared and all of your work. I'm curious about as such a champion of the ordinary, what it's like for you to experience the fame and glory that is prescribed to you, and if it changes how you relate to people. I'm wondering about kindness, and if it changes how people are to you. Yeah,
well, in actual, this is also not a modest comment, but in actuality, I live a very small life. My life is really my family and friends and my work. I'm not in the world a lot, and I've never wanted. I mean, the people I knew and the people of my generation never wanted to be rich and famous. It just wasn't like that. And I don't either. I mean, it was enjoyable for my friends and my family when my picture was in the newspaper a long time ago. But that's all. And you can't, it's not a good idea really to be a famous psychoanalyst. You see what I mean? For an obvious reason. Because in a way, psychoanalysis is the analysis of the idea of a guru, of anything oracular. So I was very determined to enjoy it as much as I could, but not overplay it. That's really the point. Yeah, I think I'll leave it at that.
There's much talk in America of dual crises of loneliness and mental health and anxiety. In addition to being more kind to each other in general, I'm wondering what you think are kind of accelerants of that in our current time, because it seems to be an accelerating process. And also, if you think that it might be somewhat of a uniquely American phenomena, particularly because we have the American myth of anyone can make it here, the American dream, so to speak. And if that creates an increased sense of failure if you haven't made it vocationally, as you were speaking of before.
I don't, for an obvious reason, feel I can talk about America. I do think, even though this sounds rather adolescent, that this is to do with capitalism. That any culture that cultivates competition rather than collaboration is fucked. It can't possibly, it just can't create enough fellow feeling. And it seems to me this is as what we are seeing. I mean, who knows what we're seeing, but it's one of the things we are seeing. Because it is terrible to live in a world, for example, where there is homelessness. It seems to me astonishing, and how also easily we accommodate to it. Well, all these things that we have to inure ourselves to are all really bad symptoms of an absolute failure of fellow feeling. And, for me again, psychoanalysis, which is a minuscule thing, is about fellow feeling. And it's about the fact that we're all in the same boat. These homeless people out in the street, they were babies once. They were somebody's children. It's terrible. It's really terrible. And it would seem to me, we therefore have to do what we can about that. Because the defeatedness is obviously part of the problem.
If I could ask you a question, Adam, in what way is a good analysis similar to a good conversation?
I think, in a way, at its best, analysis facilitates one's capacity to have a good conversation. Frost said, we have education so we can listen to other people without losing our temper. And I think psychoanalysis, at its best, makes it possible for people to gradually learn to be less intimidated by each other and themselves, and then be genuinely interested and enjoy a so-called freer exchange. And it does seem to me an amazing idea and contribution that there should be somebody to whom you can say whatever comes into your head. Now, Ferenczi said, because he was a genius, why can't we all do this with each other? Why can people only do this with analysts? And it is, of course, a very interesting question. Why don't we just say whatever we think to anybody?
That's such a great idea.
And, there obviously is an answer to that question. But nevertheless, Freud was modeling implicitly a different version of sociability, of what people might do together that they might enjoy and value. And of course, it is a conversation. But it's a conversation that begins by not having a conversation. That's the thing about it. It's as though the conversation bit is like a developmental achievement. But to begin with, you may need a relatively silent analyst who will listen. Because it's really a listening cure. It's not a talking cure, it's a listening cure. And being listened to means somebody actually having an appetite to take in what you're saying and to think about it and to feel it and so on. So it's like an education in being receptive.
David had a question here in the front. Oops.
Hi. There was a second time you mentioned the word appetite. There was the appetite to listen, but appetite came up earlier in a different context. So.
Well, appetite is the name of the game, it seems to me. And of course, Freud, but not only Freud, Darwin, more than Freud in some ways, sees the fundamental problem is our relationship to our appetite. And that is our fundamental relationship to being dependent. Because obviously, to have an appetite is to depend on something outside of oneself. And the biological essentialism of psychoanalysis, not only psychoanalysis, says we are born with these appetites. And then the question is how the environment facilitates them, or preempts them, or discourages them, but how the environment responds. How the mother, in the first instance, actually understands and responds to whatever she takes it that the infant is communicating or needs to make known. Of course, this begins pre-linguistically, but it's something to do with that. And as you know, what psychoanalysis does is, modern psychoanalysis, is it says the child is not in search of gratification, but in search of relationship. So, there were famous experiments where, they're vile experiments, but they were done, when people would give baby monkeys bottles. The idea being that if this is an entirely materialist idea, then the baby monkey just wants food. Well, of course, the baby monkeys became depressed, because they didn't just want food. They want food, if you like, was the medium of the connection with the mother. So it changes, appetite then becomes, if you like, the form that sociability takes. And I think that's what's being suggested in psychoanalysis. But you can see it in babies and young children. They have a fantastic appetite for life. Children are not suicidal. They really want to do things. They have tremendous appetite for life. And of course, everybody then wonders, and what happens to that? Why is it diminished at all? Why doesn't it get stronger?
What about greed?
Well, greed would seem to me to be appetite derailed. That in greed there's a despair about satisfaction. So instead of getting what you want, you believe that you need to get as much as you can of what there is. And it's a terrible false solution. I mean, this isn't true of all greed, but I think that's one version of this. But I think greed, in this story, greed would be appetite in a way that's been sabotaged or that is born of despair. That you're greedy because somehow you don't believe that what you want or need is actually there. So you fob yourself off by filling yourself up rather than being able to think what it is you want.
In thinking of your project as literary and your own sense of self as a writer, and thinking again about the case study, which is not your chosen genre, but can be so illuminating, I would suggest, especially if we think of sort of the tradition of which someone like Oliver Sacks is an exemplar in an adjacent domain, psychiatry, neurology, neuroscience, where so much of the human mind is exposed to us. Its vagaries, its idiosyncrasies, its power, its adaptability, and is done as a literary project. Yalom and Luria. I'm just wondering what you make of that tradition, which is, and that writerly style, and the case study in that vein.
I don't like it. I mean, this is my personal problem. This is not some account of what we should all be doing at all. But there is something about, and I find this with Sacks, but also with loads of other people, that it feels to me extremely exploitative in the name of, as it were, human progress. And it's not that I feel cynical about their intentions, I don't know what their intentions are, but there's something about that use of other people that I don't like. I mean, I'm not asking you to agree with me, I'm just telling you what I think. But I find case histories offensive, whereas I love novels.
Hello, thank you for being here and sharing your ideas. And
Sorry, where are you speaking from?
Here I am. Like, should I stand up?
Ah.
Sorry about it. Again, like, thank you for being here and sharing your ideas. And you stated
Could you speak up a bit?
Yeah, you stated that the kindness is something like beneficial and that like we can get used out of it. Basically, like we are being kind to each other, so we will be like more happy. And I think there is a kind of sad and interesting relationship between that. If you are living in a difficult condition, it can be like economically or politically, I think we are losing our being kind to each other because of like how like the life circumstances are difficult. So do you think that this is something related that the egos or like super egos that we created for ourselves indicating that maybe like we are kind of failing to be in a specific situation, maybe like we are just failed in terms of like economical or maybe like in terms of being in a difficult position, like maybe like politically, being in a wrong country, being in a like wrong job, let's say, I don't know. Even though we can take the benefit out of it, being kind to each other like more, we are not being able to do that much. Yeah.
I think it's about the material conditions that affect whether people can be kind.
Yeah, I mean, clearly this is an economic problem as well, because psychoanalysis takes an awful lot for granted in terms of people's affluence, because clearly, and you know, it is a very vivid blind spot in psychoanalysis is class, because class is very rarely referred to as a significant thing, and that's the way in which psychoanalysis can feel like sort of armchair philosophy, in a way, because it's as though, and of course this was Marx's view, that if you don't address the economic infrastructure or preconditions, you can't really get a grip on anything else. And so that's why I think, in a way, psychoanalysis needs to be, as it were, influenced by good, useful political theory, because psychoanalysis is political all the way down, actually. How could it not be?
May I slide in a question? Because you started out working in the public sector, and you've now gone into private practice. How do you find that different, just in the work you do?
Well, it was a defeat. I mean, when the great thing about the National Health Service was that anybody could have psychotherapy free. And indeed, we had walk-in clinics where people walked in off the street. When we begun, the people who managed us would say, you can see children for as long as it takes. By the time I left, this is why I and some of my friends left, they would say, we'll pay for 2 sessions, and we want an outcome study. Well, in other words, once neoliberalism kicked in, we were being managed by people who had no interest in what we did. And then, in a sense, it was incommensurate. There was no way you could practice what I took and several of us took to be psychotherapy in that context. So we left, but it was really a defeat because I didn't want to do private practice, you see what I mean? And lots of child psychotherapists were very politically idealistic because it was available in the health service. And we lost that in sort of, 6 months, more or less. And all those sort of fantasies of sort of Robin Hood clinics and so on, where we charge rich people a lot of money and make it available to poor people, so-called poor people, it didn't work like that. Nobody could make it workable. Because once you're in private practice, you see middle-class people in the kind of private practice that I'm familiar with. And it's very, very difficult to extend your range of people. Whereas what for me was wonderful about working in the health service was you saw all sorts of people. Because obviously it was an entitlement, if you like. Anybody could use it. And it was very striking that how many different kinds of people could use psychoanalysis. Because the way we were educated, you'd think only, affluent people in Vienna are really going to be able to respond to this. Well, actually, it wasn't true. And what we all found very quickly was loads of people actually really wanted to have conversations. And they really wanted to have psychoanalytic conversations, and they could be interested in psychoanalysis. And this was, across a very large range of people. And ages and generations and so-called races, it was true. It really worked. Not take up your bed and walk worked, but it worked as in people were engaged and enough people found it useful. So the private practice thing was and is a defeat.
Is there an economic model for sliding scales? I mean, is this an active conversation in the psychoanalytic community?
I think it is, and certainly, I charge people sort of nothing to £120. And I think a lot of the people I know do something comparable. But the question is, how do people get to you? Or who hears of you? Who thinks this is a viable option? Not very many people.
And presumably you had connections with social workers and doctors,
Oh, yeah.
and it's also the integration into a wider culture
Well,
that the glory days had.
that was the thing, that it was collaborative. So when I saw a child, someone else would see the family, there were educational psychologists, social workers, lots of different people. So it was teamwork. Whereas once you're on your own, you're on your own. And it's dismaying.
Hi, I have a question. So my question is about aging and sometimes the failing of the mind. I once spoke with an analyst who was facing brain cancer surgery, and I asked her about her patients, if any of them were afraid of her coming back without her full kind of memory of their stories. And I've also talked to aging analysts who have tried to decide when the right time to retire is, because they don't want to start forgetting and then to not notice themselves. And I wonder, given your age and how early you started the process, you must have lost your first analyst by now. And what that was like to have, to know that not only you're done with the process, at least for then, but that the keeper of your private story, the story you co-created in the process, is gone.
Well, it's funny you should say this. Funny isn't exactly the right word, because I decided to retire in 2 years at Christmas. And I don't know entirely what the reason was, but one of the reasons was that analysts in previous generations had sort of died in their chairs. Analysts never retired for my generation. And that seemed to me to be very irresponsible and rather potentially undignified for the reasons you suggested. And I think a lot of analysts did believe they could go on forever. Of course, everybody knows who comes for analysis that they and the analyst are aging. And everybody knows at some level that anybody could die at any moment, but it's not talked about. And indeed, there's a very interesting American analyst called Erwin Hoffman, who talks about adaptation to mortality and how this is a blind spot in psychoanalysis. And it is. I think that one of the things that one can't help but be talking about in any treatment is the fact that everybody's getting older. I mean, every single person in this room is getting older every second, but nobody's thinking, I'm getting older every second. But we are. And so it's a very strange double think, this. And it would seem to me that it needs to be incorporated in the way that psychoanalysts talk to their patients, in the full knowledge we're all aging, and it really has an effect.
Something you say somewhere else is getting older is always for beginners.
Yes.
So, sorry.
Have you spoken with many Holocaust survivors? And have you had success in ameliorating their condition?
The answer to that question is no, but I have seen people who have relatives who are Holocaust survivors, and as you probably know, there's a huge amount of literature and work on precisely this. My knowledge of it is only abstract, if you see what I mean. And I've seen people whose parents were Holocaust survivors. And I think that there's no available generalization here, except of course, yes, exactly. Yes, and there are transgenerational traumas, and they're really, really powerful, obviously. And it's always a question, one way or another, of what people are able either to recover from or they're able to make of their traumas. You know, because the traditional view, so to speak, of trauma is it stops development, that it stops you in your tracks. And there are much more interesting ideas around now about how, in a way, trauma is as with the stuff of development. The question is always what you make of the traumatic experiences. And you know, there are people who talk about growing up as a cumulative trauma. Now, it's not a cumulative trauma like the Holocaust is, but there are traumas in growing up, clearly. And in a way, that is the medium that psychoanalysis works with, because there are always transgenerational traumas, and of course, they're the ones that are the least known about very often.
When you talk about the value of talk about the value of people losing interest in themselves and finding other people more interesting, it makes sense to me that you have a great interest in Shakespeare. It seems to me maybe a supreme example of being interested in all others.
Yeah.
And in King Lear, you face that extremist version of bleakness that you talk about, and it seems like the only answer that's offered is fellow feeling, is small acts of kindness. Is that some of why Shakespeare is so persistent in your work?
I just don't know that. I can't tell, except to say that I've had the experience that those of us who like that stuff feel, which is it's an astonishing articulation of such a wide range of feeling. But I find these Shakespeare plays really astonishing, and more astonishing, not less, as you get older and as time goes on.
This right here. This notion of losing interest in oneself is so revolutionary to me, and I love it for that reason, as someone who spends at least half an hour journaling every single day trying to figure out what's going on in my head. And I'm wondering, do you lose interest in yourself when you know yourself so well that you no longer feel the need to analyze your past, or do you lose interest in yourself when you realize how much joy and love and kindness there is to find in others, or is it a combination of those two, or neither?
Well, the trouble is that none of the generalizations are true. So I think generally one can't answer that question. I mean, it seems to be logical, and I think it's one psychoanalytic assumption that there is a way of knowing yourself that will free you not to be interested in yourself, as though you will accumulate enough sense of yourself such that you won't need to go on doing that, as though you will have equipped yourself for whatever the future brings to you. And it may be true, and it may be true sometimes, and it may be true for some people. But I think this is not obviously a counsel of altruism, and it's not a counsel of self-sacrifice. It's realizing, or getting to a point over a period, that being interested in oneself doesn't get one the life one wants. That it has limited nourishment and limited enliveningness. And if those are your criteria, then that's going to matter. Because I think, the experience you describe of, endlessly thinking about oneself is obviously a very common experience. And then the question is, A, is it a waste of time? And B, how has it come about? Why is this something that one finds oneself doing? And what does one think one's doing in doing that, in repetitive rumination? Well, psychoanalysis, obviously Freud, is very interested in the idea of repetition as a defense. And apart from anything else, obviously, it's a defense against the future. It's the defense against news. There will be no news as long as you keep thinking the same thing.
I've noticed, increasingly, or very often, is from Shakespeare.
Yes.
And this is an interesting one, something I'll ask you more about. I mean, the philosopher Bernard Williams, he used to draw his examples from Rousseau and places like this, and the other serious philosophers would come and say, well, that's just stories. You can't get moral philosophical ideas out of stories. You have to get them out of real life. And he said, if you try and take an example from real life, you're not taking an example from real life. What you're doing is you're writing bad fiction. So you may as well go and find some good literature which will give you the real examples. And for you, that's very often Shakespeare.
Yeah.
And
Can I just add one thing?
Yeah, add something.
Bernard Williams said, unimaginative writing comes from arguing with the wrong people. And that every psychoanalyst should have written on their form.
But well, you talk with Shakespeare quite a lot.
Well, yes, but for me, one of the things about writing is I can't in real life remember anything. You see what I mean? I don't remember the books, I really don't remember quotations. When I write, I can remember everything. And that's part of the pleasure of doing it. It's like being a medium, to put it slightly exaggeratedly. Anyway, when I write, the quotations come to me quite often. And of course, I studied literature at university and at school, and this was the stuff that I was really engaged by. And there it is.
Wow.
And often it just seems more interesting.
Because the quotations are there. I mean, you're going to have lots of people in the audience who are very familiar with your work. I mean, one thing that makes your work very striking is its use of the epigram and the epigraph. So your own style is aphoristic, but you'll often bring in a good line from somewhere else, and you're using it to set the tone.
Well, I want the writing to be like an open university, as in things that have struck me are circulated. So I quote loads of things that I think are wonderful.
Yeah.
And so the reader can see what they think.
And do you live with those quotations in your day-to-day?
Yes, but they're not in my mind. That's the thing. Yeah. They're in my mind when I write, but otherwise, they're not.
Can you speak a little bit? Much of your work is engaged with an argument with, or an engagement, a conversation with Shakespeare, a conversation with William James, a conversation with the text, but you also do collaborations with other thinkers. You did that wonderful book on second chances with Stephen Greenblatt. You've also done a book with Bersani. You've done a book with your wife. Can you talk about the project of collaboration?
Yeah, I like the idea of collaboration, but it seems to be at odds with writing because it's so solitary.
Yeah, you just have a sort of, it seems you sort of break up the book and
yes, and I think
time.
Yes, and what's happened with each of these collaborations is they've come out of a conversation between us. And with Leo and with Barbara, Leo wrote a book called Intimacies, and he sent it to me and said, what do you think? And I said a few things, and he said, then why don't you reply to the book? And that's how that book was written. With Stephen Greenblatt, he'd said, as I was telling you earlier, he said he was going to write a book on Shakespeare and second chances. And when he said it, I thought, all psychoanalysis is about second chances. And so then we wrote the book together. And that's how it happened. So it comes like that. With Barbara, we did decide to write a book on kindness, partly because she was a historian, and she wanted to write the history, and I can do the psychoanalytic bit. So there's a division of labour, and what has happened in all these collaborations, which are with very different people, is that each of us has written our bit by ourselves, sent it to the other one, not to be corrected, but just simply for a response. And so there's a limited mutual impact, if you see what I mean, but there's a knowledge of what's going on. It's much more about acknowledgement. But there's been no attempt to write a unified book, because that would seem not to be the point, in a way, that there are different voices, and either it works or it doesn't.
And I had a question then. So collaboration, as a kind of happy kind of experience. Just thinking again about some of the themes of the compassionate conversations, or sort of the Institute to Study Hate and Kindness. Another theme through your work, I mean, you can agree or disagree, you seem to be very interested in how tempting in ordinary life cruelty is. Sadism, finding willing masochist, and masochist looking for a sadism. Mm-hmm. It's almost as if people aren't careful, it becomes a kind of default position. And a lot of your writing, one of the ways it's so inspiring or interesting, or what Walter Payton might call relief, right, is that it's often giving a reader a way of thinking their way out of what we might call something more sadomasochistic.
Yeah.
And I wonder if you could just elaborate on that theme, which I think is a powerful theme in your
Yeah,
book.
it is. Well, one of the things that was baffling to me and dismaying about training to be a child analyst was how really depressing the theory was. Because the account of what a person was, or what a child was often, to me, so vile, and so, in a way, not remote from experience, but not immediately obvious. And by temperament, I'm not miserable, you know, for all sorts of reasons. And so it was felt when I was training that to be a relatively happy person meant you were kind of shallow. The deep people knew that life is really a nightmare. And the question is whether we can survive this nightmare in a depressed world. Well, this seemed to me, this was just at odds with the sensibility I had. So when I found Winnicott, it was all very different, because Winnicott clearly doesn't believe in the death instinct, and he does believe that aggression is reactive to frustration, and he doesn't believe that it's a vale of tears. He believes it's a place where we can actually enjoy ourselves. That's a real possibility. And one of the things, I'm sorry, do you want to go on?
No.
Well, just briefly. One of the things about writing about kindness was, that seemed to me to be obvious, which is that when we are kind to other people, or they are kind to us, our lives are happier. It's just much nicer. So it seems to me so obviously a pleasure. And therefore it's a mystery why people aren't extremely consistently kind to each other and to themselves. Because it's actually a pleasure. Well, clearly, that's the reason we're not, because it is a pleasure. And so what psychoanalysis does give you good ideas about is one's wish to attack one's pleasure, or one's capacity to turn one's suffering into pleasure. And that's the tricky bit.
There's a quote I like of yours that says, the version of psychoanalysis that I want to promote is more committed to happiness and inspiration and the miscellaneous, I love that too, than to self-knowledge, rigorous thinking, or the depths of being capitalized. Psychoanalysis does not need any more abstruse or sentimental abstractions, any new paradigms or radical revisions. It just needs more good sentences. And then you said, as a sort of off-the-cuff thing, you said that you realize now that the psychoanalytic world seemed grim to you when you started out, because the owners of psychoanalysis were all middle-aged and older. And I wondered, now that you're middle-aged...
And older.
Oh, no. Do you consider life more grim? I bet you don't.
No, I don't. I mean, I was actually very young when I trained. I was 23. The owners of psychoanalysis were all at least in their 50s or 60s and 70s. And they weren't all miserable people. There were some sort of wonderful people, but there were a lot of miserable people. And there were a lot of very cross people too. And it sort of set the tone, in a way, for the whole thing. And it just wasn't my idea of fun or my idea of psychoanalysis. When I went into it, psychoanalysis was and is a real romance to me. It's an adventure. I was given a list of analysts to go and see. And the first one, I didn't obviously know any of these people. I'd never met an analyst. I'd never met anybody who'd been in it. So I went along to this flat in Maida Vale. And this, presumably this middle-aged man came to the door. He let me into his room. And we sat in silence. And as it happens, sitting in silence doesn't agitate me. But I also thought it was a bit pointless. So after about 10 minutes of this, I said, perhaps you could tell me something about yourself. He said, I was trained by R.D. Laing. That didn't mean a huge amount to me, but it meant something. Anyway, more silence. So we sit there about a quarter of an hour, And then he says, I'm sorry, Mr. Phillips, but you're not psychotic enough for me, so I can't take you. That'll be £65. At which point, I left, obviously, but it was really dismaying, because this was really not my idea of fun, and I thought it would be much more inspiring. And then, fortunately, my person who became an analyst was that. But my first taste was not good, and it was very dispiriting. And if I hadn't been determined to do it, I could easily at that point have left it.
And psychoanalysis, I mean, one way of thinking about psychoanalysis, it is very attached to the gloomy things.
Yeah.
I mean, civilization's discontents, but also, Freud is maybe the greatest philosopher of loss. He's
absolutely
very preoccupied by the fact we're all losers.
Yeah.
In the end, it's a losing game.
Yeah.
So, how do you, accepting that, people have called your version of psychoanalysis, and I'm not sure if you would agree with this, I like it, so it's a kind of Emersonian psychoanalysis, the Emerson who says, up again, old heart.
Yeah.
But how do we get to an Emersonian psychoanalysis from a Freudian focus on losing?
Well, it's very striking, isn't it? Children's capacity for pleasure. I mean, it's amazing how much they can enjoy themselves. Well, that must be telling us something. And of course, children are cruel, as we all are, but that's not in my experience, that's not the abiding experience. They want to enjoy themselves. They also want to enjoy other people's company.
Yeah.
So you never gather from reading psychoanalytic literature that people can really enjoy each other's company. This seems to me baffling. It's also true that psychoanalysts who believe that we are fundamentally ambivalent creatures never talk about what they hate about psychoanalysis. And this is really a strange oversight in a theory that is full of hate in lots of ways. And it's not that my feeling about this is not a sort of let's look at the bright side at all, because I think psychoanalysis is good because it is genuinely a sort of elaborated, complex view of what a life is. But it's strangely biased towards misery. And there must be lots of reasons for this, obviously, but certainly that post-war generation, after 2 world wars, it must have is very difficult to know what about so-called human nature you're going to have confidence in. That scale of aggression, devastation, you think, this is incomprehensible and sort of unbearable. So at least psychoanalysis picks up, really interestingly, I think, on all the ways in which we hate life and hate our lives and hate our pleasures. But we hate them because they are pleasures. And what psychoanalysis hasn't done a very good job of is giving a good account of why pleasure might matter, of why really it's partly a question of finding out what your sustaining enjoyments are. Because without those, why bother? I mean, it seems astonishing to me how few people kill themselves. What people are willing to put up with. And you think, in a secular culture, what possible justification could you have for suffering at all? Why bother? Seems amazing.
The other thing that Freud is really interested in is appetite.
Yeah.
So that's the other side of it. So something keeps us wanting more.
Yeah, exactly.
And probably the reason, maybe one reason more people don't kill themselves is exactly what you said, is the relational bonds we have with each other.
Yeah.
You're not very, I was interested in what you say about the culture in which you say, if you live in a culture which is fascinated by the myth of the artist, and the idea that the vocational artistic life is one of the best lives available, then there's always going to be a temptation for people who are suffering to believe that to become an artist would be the solution, when in fact it may be more of a problem. There are a number of people whom you might think of as casualties of the myth of the artist. They really should have done something else. Talk about that.
Well, a lot of people have been very cross with that.
I can imagine.
Yeah, and I can't imagine. It seems to me it's a very tyrannical ideal, this, that the best life is the vocational life. And it puts a huge amount of pressure on people to come up with some astonishing gift or talent. And it doesn't give enough latitude for a whole range of so-called ordinary lives.
So in other words, you would advocate following your passion, but perhaps as an amateur. You know,
Yes, an amateur life, exactly.
Yeah.
And that it would be, therefore, much more about really knowing what and who you enjoy and are moved by, and following that, as opposed to becoming a great genius.
It's always a bad idea to become a great genius.
I mean, the whole, in my view, the whole model is a poor one, because it makes so many people feel like they're failing. And not everybody can discover some vocation, but people can discover a whole range of pleasures, of things they enjoy, that are perfectly sufficient. And that would seem to me to be good enough. Whereas if we create ego ideals that are tyrannical, that effectively humiliate us or diminish us, then we're always failing.
It's interesting because you also wrote that somebody asked you, I think, what to make of the fact that psychoanalysis no longer holds the sway on the culture that it once did. And you said you think it was probably the best thing that's ever happened to it, that it doesn't have the prestige it once did. And so,
well, it seems to me that well, once now, psychoanalysis has no prestige, no glamour, no intellectual position particularly, and there's not a huge amount of money in it. So you would only do it if you really loved it, if it really interested you. So my hope is that that falling out of favour will work, because you'll only do it if you are really interested in it. There'll be no other reason. Whereas, of course, in France, in the 60s and 70s, it was about the most glamorous intellectual project. It was the only game in town. It's never been like that in Britain, and I don't think it's quite been like that here. But I think that psychoanalysis will gain from the absence of geniuses and the absence of glamour. That's my wish.
It's a bit like writing poetry. You don't do it for the money.
Exactly.
Glamour, yeah.
You do it because that's what you do.
Yeah. Well, I realise we've got a lot of people in the audience,
yes,
and we wanted to open up, give lots of time for questions, because
you know you all have them.
We want a big discussion. So maybe it would be time now to open up to audience questions.
Yes, and we have some microphones, so if you don't mind.
Oh, hello. Hi, over here. I feel bad asking you to elaborate about this, but I want to understand what feels so cruel potentially about case histories in psychoanalytic writing to you. And I'm asking in part because it's so much taught when you're learning the subject. It's so involved.
I know.
And so it's something that it wouldn't occur when you're learning is potentially a cruel act.
Yeah, I mean, I think really the way to learn about psychoanalysis is to have an analysis and to have supervised cases. That's really the way. And I think case histories can give you the illusion of knowing what's going on between two people. My objection to it is that is somebody coming to see me with the knowledge of the possibility that I might use this relationship or this encounter to write something, because they haven't contracted into that. And so it seems to me to be intrinsically exploitative under the guise of being scientifically useful. This is what we should be doing, writing case histories. Well, I think it's what we shouldn't be doing. And I think we should make the case why it's a bad idea, and we should reassure people, the people we actually see, that we are not going to write about them. That we're not doing this to further something of ourselves in that sense. It's about what goes on between the two people. Because obviously, once there's writing involved, there's a whole world involved. Loads of people are now joining in.
Here. Sorry. I think that you identified suicide as the extreme representation of giving up. So I'm interested in your thoughts about the changing demographics of suicide with time, and specifically whether this could actually be a reflection of the increased medicalization of the human condition at the expense of a loss of influence on psychoanalysis,
I really don't want to frustrate you, but I can't answer grandiose questions like that.
Okay.
I just don't have whatever the intelligence is to be able to answer that question. I just don't have the sociology, I don't have the history. It's a real question, but I just wouldn't know where to start.
Thanks.
Thank you for your presence here. My curiosity is around the relationship between self-kindness and kindness towards others.
Well, obviously there's a very available cliche, which is you can only be kind to others if you're kind to yourself. I think that's very unlikely to be true, really. but I do think that effectively, the interesting thing is the nature of kindness. And I don't think, ideally, one might have had the parenting that enabled one to be kind to oneself. Now, being kind to oneself might mean lots of different things to different people, but one of the things it might mean would be that you are not unduly punitive or unduly restrictive, or you might have the courage of your impulses, let's say. It's one possibility. I think, actually, it's very often easier to be kind to other people than to be kind to oneself, which is a strange, and not true for everybody, but it's a strange paradox that. It's as though it's delegated. And it may be that one of the things that an analysis can do for you is enable you to actually explore what you think it might be to be kind to yourself. Because I think the point about analysis is it isn't the right word, but it sort of deconstructs your assumptions. So I think I know what I'm talking about when I use the word kind. Well, I may need to find out, and it may need to be looked into, which is one of the things that I'm sure people know here. There's a Lacanian technique which is called returning the signifier. Now all that means is you say the word back to the patient that they've just used. And it can be very revealing, because it means you then have to think about why that word and what that word might mean to you. So that all these words that are second nature may need to be unpacked and redescribed. I think that's really the point.
I think we've got time for one final question.
So I think this is a great way to end it. How do you propose we unlearn the habit of denying ourselves the pleasure of being kind to others?
How do we
unlearn
the habit of denying the pleasure of kindness?
I think it's really easy. This to me is the baffling thing. I think it's fantastically easy to be kind, if you want to be. So I don't think there's a great mystery here. I don't think this is esoteric. I don't think this is a special subject, because obviously the word kind refers to the fact that we are all of the same kind. And it would seem to me that there's a fundamental identification with the sufferings and the pleasures of other people. And because that can become excessive, we then inure ourselves, and we're less and less able to identify with other people. And I think the project should be keeping able to identify.
And on that note,
thank you.
So this has been an enormously stimulating evening. Really just an incredible intellectual explosion. I want to first thank our wonderful interlocutors, Mona Simpson and David Russell. Adam, we can't thank you enough for being with us for the last 2 days. You've enriched our lives and particularly our minds enormously over the course of these 3 presentations. Thank you so much.
Well, can I just say that obviously joke is only as good as its audience. And that this has been really a pleasure for me for comparable reasons, because people have been attentive and interested. And that's fabulous.
Wonderful.
So I'm grateful. Thank you.